What's up, No Nation? This is Jesse from Plant to Spear, joined by my co-host Michael, and we got some things to talk about today. Michael, I've done a deep dive, or I've tried to do a deep dive on what is strength of schedule anyway. Everybody
Yeah.
talks about why Florida State got left out of the CFP and all that stuff because you had a low strength of schedule and everything. And I've tried to look this up, and I've got some pretty interesting notes I want to share with you. We're going to kind of
Okay.
talk a little bit more about that. We're going to talk about some of the portal moves if we have enough time. We're going to talk about the lawsuit that's come out with the Florida AG and all this stuff that's going on around this issue. So I know there's a lot coming up. You got early signing day, you got portal moves, you got a bowl game coming up in a little bit. So we got other things that we got to turn our attention to at some point. But for right now, I just thought this would make a pretty interesting discussion and some pretty interesting notes that I have. So I'm gonna do a little bit of extra talking in this one to kind of I just want to share some of the things and get your reaction on them.
Yeah.
And I feel like at the end of this, I haven't done my job if either you or the audience doesn't sit back and at least go,
Hmm.
at least make you think. So this is not about, oh, Florida State should have made it in. This is not
Right.
about we got cheated. This is not about putting our tinfoil hats on. This is simply about having an open dialogue about strength of schedule in
Okay.
college football. So with that being said, Michael, I really appreciate you joining me for today's show. How are you, my friend?
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on again, Jesse. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing this. I know you've been doing a lot of great research and a lot of in-depth into this idea of strength of schedule and kind of what goes behind it. And I'm looking forward to really having my mind opened around this so that I can fully understand, what is this crazy NASA-like calculation to get to the strength of schedule, and how do we understand it, and how does it get leverage in college football? Because there's no other sport that outside of college football that leverages a strength of schedule. On every other sport, including other college sports, it's about wins and losses. But in
Right.
college football, apparently what we've learned is wins and losses don't matter as much as strength of record, strength of schedule, eye test, and subjectivity.
Right. And I think you bring up a good point because Florida State did have the number 3 strength of record, which is,
Mm-hmm.
what a team would have done against your schedule. So that was there. That was along the lines of what you wanted to see. But the strength of schedule was at 55th. And I tried to do a lot of research because I was like, let me just see how this is even calculated. And from what I could understand, from what I could find, it seems like everybody kind of has their own little formula. Because if you look at, say, and I look at things throughout the season, PFF, some team ranking sites, ESPN, you look at all these different things, and they all kind of have different numbers.
Right.
So it's like if we're all using the same formula, how do we get different numbers? That's
Right.
the issue. We don't all use the same formula, and there is some subjectivity to it, which leaves it open to not using like raw data. And so there's just some inconsistencies that I have with that. And so the first one that I do want to address is the fact that a lot of people immediately point to Florida State's combined opponent record. It is not as good as anybody in the top 8. And so I get what people are saying with that conversation. But here's the issue why I find that inconsistent. So the perfect example is if you take two common opponents throughout the two top 5 teams between Alabama and Florida State. So let's use two opponents on each team's schedule as an example. So you have Chattanooga, who Alabama played this year. FCS team beat them 66-10 or something like that.
Yep.
It was a
That's
lot to
right.
not a lot. Exactly what you would expect. So Chattanooga is 8-5, made the FCS playoff. Sounds like a pretty decent team.
Right.
So then Florida State, on the other hand, played little old Northern Alabama, went
Little old.
3-8.
Yep.
They're a nobody. You beat them 58-13. So you beat them handily too. Well, here's the problem. So if you look at just raw wins versus loss combined opponent records, so obviously you would immediately think on the surface that Chattanooga, an 8-5 FCS team who made the FCS playoffs, they got to be better than North Alabama, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
until you realize that North Alabama beat Chattanooga by 2 touchdowns at their field the
Oh,
first game of the
wow.
season. So at the same time, when you look at that, it's like that's why you cannot take just raw records
Right.
and add them up and tell me who's better than who's not. Because if you look at why Texas got into the playoffs, it was
Right.
because they had the head-to-head over Alabama.
Correct.
So in a sense, would you say now if the head-to-head is so important, and this will make a little bit more sense later, but would you say that the head-to-head is so important that a 3-8 team is better than an 8-5 team that made the playoffs? Because if
Mhm.
that is the case, then Florida State should get more value out of the 3-8 North Alabama win than
Correct.
Chattanooga, or Alabama should get out of the Chattanooga win. And you're starting right now, if you're building up your opponent records, one of you is starting with 5 extra wins, and one of
Correct.
you is starting with down 3 losses. So, you're already starting with like a negative balance by playing a team that beat the team that goes more towards Alabama's strength of schedule. So that doesn't
Correct.
make a whole lot of sense. And I think it also depends on if you have a couple outliers. Like when they played Georgia, that was I think 12-0 at the time, 11-1 at the end. If you think about it, and this was something I was trying to explain to you earlier, and sometimes it can get a little complicated, a little muddy to explain. So let me not talk so fast when I say this. But so if you played 12 teams, right, and you were to play one 11-1, or say one 12-0 Power 5 team, and then you played 11 6-6 FCS teams, that doesn't sound like a very hard schedule, right?
No.
But your opponent winning record would look better than if it would be the exact same if you played, say, 11 6-6 Power 5 teams and one 11-1 FCS team. Your combined opponent record is going to be the exact same.
Exact same.
That doesn't mean you played a harder schedule.
Nope.
So that's why I think the combined opponent record is a flawed argument. And then, you can also talk about, well, they had wins over a couple of top 5 teams, looking at where they beat Georgia. And that's great. And this is not just specifically about Alabama, because we're going to get
Right.
into Texas and Michigan and all that stuff later too. But it's just painting the picture that just a raw combined opponent record doesn't really paint the whole picture. And sure, the top 5 wins should count. I think they should be a huge weighting in your schedule, because that
Right.
is a massive win. But the other point that I made to you when we were talking in pre-show prep was, think back to 2020. Florida State beat number 5 North Carolina.
Yep.
They finished that season, 3-6 or 3-8?
3-8.
And then think back to when Purdue upset number 3 or something like that, Ohio State, and beat the brakes off of them.
Beat the brakes off of them.
Right, beat the brakes off of them. And so it's like, does that automatically make them a better team?
Correct.
Not always. And I think that's the answer. And I think that's why the point of this is, first off, my initial point is to rule out the just combined opponent records and saying you're worse because that's who it was. Because people don't realize the ACC also had the most amount of bowl eligible teams. So that means they had a lot of very mid-level teams that were around 6-6, 7-5.
Correct.
So, and I'm not sitting here telling you that the ACC is like playing through the AFC or anything like that. I'm not telling you that. But what I'm saying is, I think that people have a perceived notion coming into things that the SEC is so dominant, the Big Ten is so dominant, the ACC is weak because of the history. And this was not a particularly good year for the SEC. So I think that's why you have to look at things on an individual, on a one-year standpoint, because I think Georgia's another perfect example of that. Yeah, what they did the last 2 years was extremely impressive.
Right.
They didn't look like the same Georgia team this year. So I think you have to take things one year at a time. And, if you think back to the big wins and the opponent schedules and things like that, that to me is why when I started looking at these teams, and again, this is not about what you should have done with Florida State and all that stuff. I think the committee should have looked and said, hey, man, congratulations. And I'm going to talk about Texas' schedule in a second, but I'm going to kick back to you for a minute. I think you could have looked at what Texas did as their whole body of work, not just one win. Because, again, think about our example of where Florida State beat North Carolina and Purdue. You have upsets that happen all the time. App State beat Michigan, set the precedent. Hell, we lost to Jacksonville State. Come on. Upsets happen all the time.
Upsets happen.
Right. So, I'm willing to throw our skeletons out of the closet too. But the thing is, man, like I think the committee should have looked at the whole entire picture, and they should have said, man, the win that you guys had in Tuscaloosa was probably the best win of the year. That's amazing. But the rest of what you did wasn't that impressive. And they should have had the courage to give the team that didn't lose any games the opportunity to continue to compete and maybe set Texas on the side. Because the more I look at it, the more I think Texas should not have been in over Florida State. You could argue for some other teams too. It's not necessarily just specifically Alabama that everybody's mad at.
Yeah.
But I got some more numbers that we're going to get into so far or later on. But I'll kick it back to you for some thoughts on what we just talked about.
Yeah, man, I mean, first of all, thank you for that research, and you're absolutely right. Strength of schedule is such a subjective thing, because not only are you looking at how a team performed against these other teams, but then their records and how their record, like no one could anticipate, like Florida State could not anticipate that North Alabama would go 3-8. They couldn't anticipate that.
Right.
They didn't anticipate Miami going 7-5. They didn't anticipate Florida having another 5-7 season, right? They didn't anticipate that LSU would lose any other games outside of theirs. I mean, heck, we all thought Clemson probably would win the ACC title this year, right? We all picked Clemson to come in
Right.
first, right? So none of us could have anticipated this record. So you can only play the record that's right in front of you. And it's just not the same. Like, you can't compare apples to oranges. It just doesn't work. And so then to say, okay, well, Florida State, kudos to them for going 13-0, but Texas is better than them. Like, wait, what? And, and the argument, everybody wants to make the argument about Alabama. And for those people who make that argument, fine, sure, go ahead, conspiracy theory and all. My gripe is not really with Alabama being put in. It's with Texas. And I get the head-to-head. But again, just like you said, like at some point, if the committee, you said this in the pre-show, if the committee had the galls to screw Florida State, they should have had the galls to say, Texas, going into Bryant-Denny Stadium and winning is a hard thing. And winning by 10 points is even harder. So kudos to you. Great job. But the rest of your schedule is duck butter. It is like the worst. Like, you didn't play anybody. You
Right.
played you played a ranked Kansas team that should have never been ranked in the first place.
Right.
Plus, you
And I
played
will
them on
say,
your backup QB.
we're going to go through. I got all of their games
Yeah,
listed. We're going to talk about Texas in just a second. But I will say too, you bring up a good point. Like, if you look back at that win over Alabama, I mean, that's great, man. Congratulations. But that's also, if Florida State can be a different team towards the end of their schedule
correct.
because of the change at quarterback. Well, you have to think back to what that Alabama team was in week 2,
Yep,
because they had just benched Milroe for struggling
correct.
in that game. And then on top of that, you also went and struggled at South Florida, a 6-6 AAC team.
Yeah,
You were tied 3 points late in the third quarter, and you won
yeah.
17-3.
With a
So that
quarterback,
was right. So that was a different Alabama team that you beat back in the day. And
exactly.
and so my point with that is, so if Alabama started pretty rough, so to speak, and then got better throughout the season, even, mind you, the Auburn game in there, which obviously we're going to talk about that too, but it's not unreal to think that Texas started bad, got better. I mean, Alabama, and then Texas started hot and got worse when you look at
Yep,
the schedule, because that's
yep.
kind of the way it plays
That's
out when you look at
basically
their
what
strength of
happened.
schedule.
Yep.
So the next, really, and we're going to get into their schedule, but the thing is that you hear a lot of, like, with the SEC, well, you guys couldn't make it through the SEC undefeated and this, that, and the other because they beat each other up. And that's fine. That's fair if you want to say that. Every conference does that. And I will say first, before we get into this, there's a couple of points that I want to make when you talk about Power 5 football in general. First off, point that I want to make on Florida State. I'm not here to deny that Florida State caught some bad breaks. Obviously, your Heisman hopeful quarterback got hurt.
Right.
Tate got a concussion in the one game that he got to play in,
Right.
or at least went into protocol. If you'd had him at Louisville, maybe the story's a little different.
Right.
We don't necessarily believe that, but it's just a case. Louisville crapped the bed against Kentucky. You had
Yep.
Alabama, Auburn couldn't defend one pass to win the game.
Right.
So, like, you caught some bad breaks. Now, I also want to say, too, that when you just look at Power 5 football in general, I think you have some teams, obviously Alabama and Vanderbilt and, say, Florida State, Clemson, and Wake Forest are nowhere in the same ballpark as far as talent goes. But when you
Correct.
look at the middle to top tier teams, outside of a couple of programs, like just as far as raw blue chip ratios go, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, those couple of really top tier teams, Clemson and all that stuff, I think a lot of the talent levels are a lot closer than people think, especially in the portal
Yep.
era, where you may have guys going from one team to, you may have this guy who was this talented. Perfect example. If Florida State ends up getting Marvin Jones Jr., that's a 5-star that is coming over here that was at another program. So, like, you see how these players move a lot. Like,
Right.
again, you look back to the Jacksonville State game. Zarek Cooper, the quarterback for Jacksonville State, was a former 4-star, I think top 25 quarterback in the country, former Clemson player that transferred to Jacksonville State. That's why you see so many Group of 5 upsets nowadays, because the talent level is not really as far apart as people think.
Right.
But so anyway, keeping that in mind, talking about out of conference stuff, because really, if you want to talk about the SEC beats himself up, or the ACC does, or all these things, you kind of got to turn to your out of conference slate. Now, I know this isn't a perfect measurement because not everybody plays the same out of conference schedule and the same amount of teams. But the thing is, the ACC played 56 out of conference games. The big B1G, Big 10 played 42. Big 12 played 42. Pac 12 played 36. And the SEC played 56. So you have a really large sample set to gauge off of. So I went and looked at what everybody kind of did outside of their conference. And when you look at the ACC, out of the games that they scheduled, the way I broke it down was Power 5, G5, FCS, independent. Now, you could also, I factored in Notre Dame being a little bit more of a Power 5 than an independent because they're totally different than
That makes sense.
UMass and Army. And then, like, basically the ranked games. And so when you look at the ACC this season, they played 33.9% Power 5 teams out of conference, 44.6% with Notre Dame. The Big 10 played 30.9. The Big 12 played 28.6. Pac-12 played 27.7, and the SEC played 28.6. So you played the highest amount of Power 5 teams. If you factor in Notre Dame, that's by a wide margin. The G5 schools, the ACC played 23.2. The Big 10 played 47.6% G5 teams. The Big 12 played 45.2%. The Pac-12 played 41.7%. And the SEC played 41.1. So you played the most Power 5, the least
amount of G5.
Group of 5. And then when you look at FCS, because everybody plays FCS, that's how they float their programs. We don't fault anybody for that. Florida State was about even with everybody, the ACC, 25% FCS. Big 10 was 16.7. Big 12 was 26.2. The Pac-12 was 25, and the SEC was 25 as well. So, again, man, just when you look at the nature of the scheduling, the ACC has scheduled the hardest just based on Power 5 opponents. So that's when you start looking at, okay, what are their records, their combined opponent records? Well, it's not hard to have a better record when you don't play the same out-of-conference schedule. And so also I talked about the ranked games. So the ACC out-of-conference played 19.6% ranked teams out of conference. And that was when the other team was ranked. It didn't matter if the ACC team or whatever team was ranked or not. So against out-of-conference ranked opponents, you played 19.6%, and you went 4 of 7 in those.
Okay.
The Big 10 played 9.5%, so 10% less ranked games, only 4. So I'll just give you the numbers. So the ACC played, because again, they play different amount of games. So, obviously you use percentages to smooth things out. The ACC played 11 ranked games, 19.6%, went 4 of 7. 4 of those were top 10. 10 of those are still currently ranked. So the Big 10, they played 9.5%, 4 ranked games in total out of conference. They went 1 and 3. The only win they had was Ohio State over Notre Dame by 3 points on literally the last play of the game. And one of their, I'm going to read you the note just like I got it. One of their ranked games was Colorado LOL, because that was when Colorado, because they got the week 1 ranked when they played, I think, Nebraska or week 2. Right. That was a farce there. So only one of their ranked games was against top 10, and only one of the ranked games is the team is currently still ranked. Wow. That's pretty weak out of conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then so you go to the Big 12, 42 out of conference games. They played 4 ranked out of conference teams, 9.5%, 2 top 10, only 3 are still currently ranked, and they went 1 and 3. So then you look at the Pac-12. So they played 11.1%, a little bit higher than the last 2. Only 4 ranked games, went 2 and 2. None were in the top 10. And 2 of them are still currently ranked. And I also had noted down here that one of their ranked games was TCU in week 1,
which
we know TCU ended up right. They fell off a cliff really fast. And then so the SEC was actually relatively closer to you. They played 9 ranked games, 16.1%. They went 3 and 6 in those games, and one of those was Tulane versus Ole Miss. That was the only conference to play a ranked G5 opponent. Tulane is not ranked anymore. 2 of those were in the top 10. And you were currently 5 of those are currently ranked. So again, man, just looking at all these numbers, like you can see that it paints a picture that the ACC played a harder out of conference schedule. And that's, of course, including Notre Dame as out of conference, because that was 6 ranked games that the ACC had to play out of conference right there. So I think when you just say strength of schedule, it's hard, man, to quantify that, because, again, like we talked about with the combined opponent records, and then you look at what preseason rankings, how much does that factor into it? Because, again, when you look at just the ACC, and the Big 12 were the only conferences to have more teams ranked at the end of the season than
Mm,
they did at the beginning.
mm.
So that kind of tells you, now some of the teams they had the same amount, but that tells you right there that that preseason stuff does kind of weigh into your strength of schedule as well. And you know, and the last thing I'll touch on talking about this, and I'll throw it to you before we move on to some other points, is I also looked at the average scoring offense and scoring defensive rank for Power Five against Power Five because I don't really care what you did against
Right,
FCS. That doesn't mean
right,
anything.
right.
So if you look at because they do play 6 games, so if you factor in Notre Dame to this, the out of conference rank, so the average offense that the ACC played was ranked 47.9, and the defense was ranked 40.7. The Big 12 or the Big 10 was 65.6 on their offense. They don't play offense in the Big 12.
Yeah.
It's just not good. And the average defensive rank was 35th. But again, you know, when you talk about you don't play offense very good. And then so the Big 12, your average offensive rank was 38.3, a little bit higher, but the defensive rank was lower at 57.
Yeah.
So then the Pac 12 was pretty close to you at 40.3% on offense, 55.6 on defense, a little bit lower than you there. And the SEC came in at 43.9 and 50.4. So it's not like those numbers are really crazy different.
Right.
So it's like when you look at the picture as a whole, it just, I mean, I'm not here to tell you that like Boston College is a powerhouse, that
Right.
Syracuse is a powerhouse. I'm not telling you
Right.
that. But what I'm saying is a lot of these other teams, when you look down the roster at the teams these guys are playing, when you look at the out of conference slate, it's not harder than what the ACC
Correct.
did
Correct. Oh yeah. Well, and like if I remember correctly, didn't the ACC have a winning record against the SEC in out of conference play this year?
against the SEC, against the
Yes.
Big Ten, and then
Eh,
they had a losing record against the Big 12, but Pitt played both of the Big 12 games and they're hot
That's
garbage.
it.
So,
Exactly. They're hot
right.
garbage. So you're already your conference basically had a winning record against every other Power Five conference. You had a winning record against the supposedly darling of the Power Five conferences, the SEC. And you're gonna say that Florida State would have come in. Like I heard something, last week, or I read somewhere. It's like, oh, if Florida State was in the SEC, they'd probably be like a 7-5 team. Are you? Wait, what?
Right.
Wait,
Yeah.
what? Like, let's just be honest, okay? Every conference is top heavy, right?
Right.
Every
Yep.
conference is. So the ACC, it's Clemson and Florida State. Really, you can add in NC State and North Carolina, whatever. It's Clemson and it's Florida State. In the SEC, you have more top heavy teams. I will give you that. You have Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, LSU, and who am I thinking? Tennessee. Those are your teams. Outside of that, everything else is a toss up, right? Because you get once in a blue moon that Auburn's good, once in a blue moon that Mississippi State's, once in like several blue moons that Mississippi State's good. Arkansas's, pretty decent, pretty good for a 7-win team sometimes, maybe 8. If they call the Hogs right, they might get 9 wins sometimes or whatever. But you're really top heavy. The Big 12, it was really always Texas and Oklahoma every single
Right.
year. The Pac-12, up until recently, it was just Washington and Oregon. And then USC came on last year. They fell off this year. UCLA came on last year. They fell off this year. And and I've said this before on the show, is that you also had the darlingization, whatever it is, the over Cinderella-ness of the Pac-12 this season because it was the last season, which the reason why it's the last season is ESPN's fault. Hello, ESPN. And then you try to have a swan song for them. But you had this oversaturation of, well, we're going to rank the Pac-12 higher because it's the last season and we feel bad and want to give them notoriety and all like that stuff. And so these teams got ranked higher than they should have gotten ranked. Like the Pac-12, like Oregon State never was a top 25 team. That was very clear. They should have never been ranked in the top 25. You look at Washington's victory and who they beat. There were a couple teams they beat. Oregon, obviously, they beat them twice. So that's all right. But Oregon didn't really play anybody. They beat they struggled against a Stanford. They beat Arizona State or Arizona when they weren't even ranked, and then later they got ranked. So they gave them credit for beating a ranked Arizona, even though they weren't ranked. And so you look at these teams and you're like, these conferences are not equally made, but they're always, all of them are top heavy. So how can you judge a team based on the schedule that was put in front of them? Again, Florida State
Right.
beat everybody they were supposed to play.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because when you look at the ACC, in my personal opinion, I think that you're maybe not as top heavy. I mean, you have two good programs that
Right.
kind of run that conference, but I think when you get to the middle meat, when you talk about, I mean, I know they haven't been good for a while, but when you talk about at least Miami and they're competitive, I mean, they beat, they kind of beat the brakes off of Texas A&M this year. So I just think that middle meat of the ACC is better than people give them credit for. I mean,
Right.
again, and even when you look at the bottom dwellers of the conference, like Vandy finished last in the SEC, and I think Wake finished last or second to last
Right.
in the ACC. So Wake Forest beat Vanderbilt 36-20 this year. Well,
Yep.
Georgia beat Vanderbilt 37-20.
That's right.
So you know what I mean? Like there's and I made a list of, and I didn't have a chance to get every single one of them, but I made a list of some interesting games that happened out of throughout out of conference mostly, that happened for each conference. And so we'll kind of look at some of these. So and again, I'm going to pull the skeletons out of the closet for the ACC too.
Yes.
So BC loses to Northern Illinois. Not a
Okay.
great look.
Not a great look.
BC then turns around and beats Holy Cross, an FCS team who, by the way, was 12-1 the year before,
Yep.
by 3 points. Again, not a good look. Now, for
Correct.
context, BC was experimenting with switching quarterbacks at that
That's
time.
right.
UVA loses to James Madison by 1 point. Well, James Madison is 11-1. They're,
Right.
they they
Right.
they might have made a New Year's Six game if they weren't on a bowl ban. So then UNC beats App State in double overtime. Again, same thing that happened last year, but UNC is they're still a little bit of a fraud.
Oh,
So
yes.
Wake Forest beats Old Dominion by 3. Marshall over Virginia Tech 48-41, and then had a close game. Or they beat Virginia Tech, then NC State beat them 48-41. So they gave us a little bit of problems there. But do remember Marshall did beat Notre Dame last year as well. And then Bowling Green over Georgia Tech was a pretty bad look as well. But when you get into the Big 12, man, and this is why a lot of the reasons I have a problem with the Texas being in, especially when you talk about Oklahoma State, that is the biggest fluff of a ranked
Yes.
team I might have
Yes.
ever seen. So
Yes.
you talk about the Big 12. So you had Texas State, not Texas, Texas State, the
Texas
Bobcats.
State.
They beat Baylor.
Yeah.
Houston beat an 8-4 AAC team, UTSA, by 3 points. The number 2 Big 12 team at the end of the season, Oklahoma State, beat Central Arkansas by 14 points, who's a 7-4 FCS team. And then they beat 8-4 Mountain West Wyoming, beat Texas Tech in double overtime. BYU over 3-9 Sam Houston State 14-0. 6-6 AAC team Rice beat Houston in double overtime. Ohio, who's 9-3, beat Iowa State. Miami of Ohio over Cincinnati in overtime. Keep in mind, Miami beats Miami of Ohio. Miami, Florida beat Miami of Ohio by 30 points.
Yes.
And see, this again, man, this is the biggest problem with me for Oklahoma State. We already talked about Oklahoma State barely beating Central Arkansas. They got their face kicked in by
Yeah.
South Alabama,
Woo.
33-7. And so Kansas, also looking at Kansas, which was during the season, they're not ranked in the final rankings, but during the season, Kansas, which was one of Texas's ranked wins, beat Nevada 31-24, 7-point game. Nevada was 2-10 and lost to FCS Idaho 33-6 the week before. There's just so many games where it's like the Big 12 just looks terrible. And then, of course, when you talk about the Big 10, they didn't play a lot of out-of-conference games, but and we know they didn't play a lot of Power 5 teams either.
Yeah.
So Purdue lost to Fresno State. Illinois beat Toledo by 2 points. Indiana won in 4 overtimes over I forget who it was. It was a pretty terrible team. Akron. Northwestern beat Howard FCS 23-20. Even in the SEC, Kentucky beat Eastern Kentucky by 11 points. That's an FCS program, even though it's a good one. Missouri, your number 3 or 4 team, and here's the thing, man. This is a good comparison. Missouri's a really good comparison. Why I think people are blowing smoke when they talk about Florida State would do this or that in the SEC. So Mizzou finished being like the number 3 or 4 team in the SEC. They hung right there with Georgia. I think it was like a 6 or 7 point game. So Missouri beat Memphis 34-27.
Yep.
And then they also beat Middle Tennessee State 23-19. So a 4-point game against Middle Tennessee State, who Alabama beat, I think it was like 50-7 or something like that in the first game. So again, man, when you talk about that number 3 or 4 team struggling against those, and then a good perfect comparison is Missouri beat Florida by 2 points on a walk-off field goal at home. And
Man.
now they did have Mertz for part of that game, and they had the backup for part of that game. But you're talking about the number 3 team in the SEC, or 4. I'm not sure where they finished because they still have divisions. It was either them or Ole Miss. So
Yeah.
a top 4 team in the SEC beats Florida the week before, or I think the week before or 2 weeks before, Florida State goes into their place with a backup quarterback and beats them 24-15. So you beat them worse than Missouri did. So, man, I don't buy the thing where, people want to talk about, oh, you beat BC by a couple of points. It was on the road in a red bandana game.
Yeah.
Mizzou struggled against Florida at home, who honestly I don't think is any really better or worse than BC probably. I mean, they probably win the game, but not by a
Right.
lot.
Right.
When you talk about being on the road in the red bandana game or either what, and Florida State had the flu in that game. So I just think, man, just looking at a lot of these, it's just there's so many questionable games, man. It's like I don't get it, and I'll let you share some thoughts, but then I got some notes here where we kind of looked at every team in the schedule, and I want to run through those in just a second for a couple of the teams. But I'll kick it back to you for some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, man, sorry, yeah, the schedule is just the schedules they don't match up, they don't line up, and so it's hard to be able to delineate, based on that. But then when you deep dive like you've done, you see where it's like, oh, there are these what feels like maybe anomalies actually are like, no, this actually is more evidence as to why this subjectivity in college football is damaging the sport. Because
Right.
in every other college sports, and college soccer, and college baseball, and college basketball, and college lacrosse, I mean, I can keep going, and wrestling, and swimming, and in cheerleading, and in the gun rifling, it all
Right.
matters what you do on the field. There's very little subjectivity. Maybe gymnastics, okay, sure, subjectivity, but everything else is wins and losses. That's
Including
how
the
you
NFL, which is the ultimate version of the sport that we're talking about.
exactly. In the NFL, there are power rankings, but that's really just to create conversation. Those power rankings have nothing to do with who gets to play for a championship. They have nothing to do with who's ranked number 1 or whatever. It has nothing to do with that. All those stats do is help tell us people who are not playing the game, well, which team number wise is better. But every week on the field, it gets determined. Those 22 guys get up on the field, they play in the NBA and the NFL and the college basketball. Those 10 guys or girls get on that court and they play. That tells us who is better, who is not. The college basketball selection committee. Now, we might gripe over the 1 or 2 teams who we think should have been in and they don't get in, but 95% of it, they get it right every year. Maybe we don't like where they put them at as far as the rankings or as far as the seedings, but they get it right. Why? Because wins and losses matter. The only time subjectivity comes into play is where are they ranked on the S curve, and where that 1 or 2 team that gets left off where they should be. Other than that, wins and loss matter. And so when we look at these records, when you start to actually dive into this fact, you're like, if you want to go by who played the best schedule and who looked the best, well, man, we can drum up all the evidence we need to disprove your point again and again. What should have mattered at the end of the day for any conversation, let's move on beyond the playoffs. For any conversation, did they win? Did they lose? That should be that's the starting point.
I agree. And that's the thing. Like, how can you necessarily just quantify that beating a 6-6 ACC team is not as good as beating a 6-6
Correct.
SEC team? And I know you can point to the examples of where, maybe you have a Kentucky that beats Louisville or something like that. That's fine. Teams get upset all the time. We just talked about
Absolutely.
that where, again, we beat North Carolina at number 5. Jacksonville State beat us as an FCS team. Like, those
Right.
things happen in a vacuum. But when you look at the season as a whole, I just think, man, I think the problem is people have the perception of, oh, this conference is this conference is that. And because of that reason, that beating a 6-6 ACC team doesn't count the same.
Yeah.
Beating NC State at 9-3 doesn't count the same as beating this other SEC team,
No,
Missouri or whoever.
no.
I think they're 10-2, like who's 9-3, and that's not necessarily the case because everybody has warts on their schedule. We just
Well,
talked about all these games that were close, out of
yeah.
conference against far lesser teams, and
Well,
so
here's a yeah.
I just don't get the preconceived notion that because of the SEC being better in the past when it was
Right.
90% Alabama,
Right. Right.
recently Georgia,
Right. And
occasional blip of LSU and
LSU.
Florida,
Right.
like
Not even Florida.
if you remove simply Alabama from the SEC, that conference looks nothing like what it did.
No, no, absolutely. You take you take those national titles out, and we're not sitting here talking about the SEC being the best conference in the world. I mean, before Alabama started winning consistently, Florida had won 2, and then they didn't have a national championship for like the longest of time, right? And so, and this is another point to this, and I know we got to move on, is when you look at Alabama's win over Auburn, okay? Now, let's we've said this over and over again, but it bears worth repeating. The week before, Alabama needed a 4th and 31 miracle to win that game against Auburn in the Plains. Auburn had just got mollywopped by a New Mexico State team that was absolutely terrible, right? And yet, people are giving them more credit for pulling that game out than Florida State going into Clemson, who had not lost in 60-something games at home,
Right.
who was basically unbeatable at home, and we won in overtime. But no. There's no credit because Clemson's whole record is not good. But
Right.
Auburn, who didn't get to go to a bowl game, who got whooped up by New Mexico State. Wow, what a win, Alabama. Like that's the subjectivity I'm talking about. That we don't
Right.
hold in the same regard the difficulty of what FSU did, which was far more difficult than what Alabama accomplished in that win against Auburn.
Right. And I think you have to, everybody knows I'm big on stats and data because numbers don't lie. But I think it's fair also to provide context to those numbers
Right.
because, again, like winning, you can say you beat 8-4 Clemson or whatever they finished. It matters where you did it because
Correct.
they beat two. Now North Carolina didn't finish ranked, but they beat 2 ranked teams at home, North Carolina and Notre Dame. Ask Notre Dame how hard it is to play
Correct.
inside Death Valley. So to me, I think you have the context of where you did it, who you did it in front of, how good those teams were on the road or at home. And then I also think there are ways to break it down. And this is actually what started my whole research thing here. There's ways to break it down that I know it's a complete team and you have to beat the entire team. There's 3 phases to the game, but that doesn't mean that you can't look at what did Florida State like. LSU's defense is cheeks, so who cares? You know what I mean? Like what you did against
That's
them.
right.
Everybody puts up yards against them, but I think it's okay to say, okay, well, look at what you did against the number 1 offense in the country.
Right.
All right, well, you go into the Clemson game. You're not gonna tip your hat or hang your hat on what you did against Clemson's offense because they were
Right.
terrible this year.
Right.
But you still played a really friggin' good defense in Clemson. So I think you could even look at it side to side like that on the different offenses, defense that you faced. And what brought me to that conversation was when you looked at Michigan's defense, because
Right.
if most of you follow me on social media, you know that I posted a few threads defending Florida State's defense and why I think it could have kept them in the playoffs. Well,
Yep.
everybody says, well, Michigan has the number 1 defense in college football. Well, that's not hard when you play 7 opponents who rank 100th or below in
Correct.
total in scoring offense. They face 0 offenses in the top 10 this year. And so I even thought like, okay, man, well, maybe they just play some really tough, Big Ten defenses. That's why they're not all that great, right? So then I went as far as to calculate your out of conference points on what you did against Power 5 defenses out of conference, and it was within 1 point of
Correct.
what those Big Ten teams score against Big Ten defenses. So that doesn't always mean the perception is the reality. It doesn't mean because you play in the Big Ten, you play great defenses.
Correct.
It just means your offenses are trash. And I'm
Right.
sorry, like it's just like the Big 12. Like their offensive rankings were really high, but their defensive rankings were relatively low. Now, is that a product of playing really good or really not? And so, that's why I tried to look when you compare the out of conference stuff and what teams did with their defenses. That's what I found so interesting is that, again, man, you look at Michigan, their offense is not impressive. When they
Right.
They barely put up any yards against Penn State, who has a good defense again.
Yep.
But you're playing in the Big Ten, and
Right.
by the way, go look at who Penn State beat.
Thank
They
you
stay ranked high, which helps your strength of schedule. They
for
didn't play
absolutely no reason.
anybody. The only
No
two
one.
really good teams they played was Ohio State, Michigan. They lost
And
both
they
of
got
them.
beat.
Right. And then so like they put up less points against Iowa, or I mean less yards against Iowa than Florida State did against Louisville with a third
Correct.
string true freshman backup. And again, that is a okay, they got the number 3 defense, Iowa. Who are they playing on offense that
Right.
is tough? Like I
Right.
said, against out of conference Power 5 defenses, Big 10 offenses score 0.7 points less on average than they
Mm.
do against Big 10 defenses. So it's not that big of a difference, and a lot of them were within that window. Now, the one thing when I said we were going to go through their schedule, so let's just go through a couple of these schedules here.
Okay.
So let's look at Bama's. Middle Tennessee State 4-8. Who cares? Texas 12-1. Lost by 2 scores at home. So yeah, congratulations. You played a tough team that ended up being
Yeah.
12-1.
Yeah.
You got beat. So
You got
it
beat.
doesn't right, like it doesn't really
You
count for
should
your
not
strength of
get this
schedule.
is not college basketball. There's no such thing as a
It's good
quality loss in college
exactly.
football.
Exactly. Everybody's like, well, they played this, that, and the other team. It's like, yeah, but they lost to
They
one of them.
lost.
And then so you get USF 6-6, but it was a close game. Ole Miss, they're 10-2. That's a really nice win.
That's a
I'm
great
not
win.
taking
Yep.
that away from you. Now, I will mention when you talk about the Mississippi schools, neither one of them have ever won jack. They've never won the
Nothing.
SEC. They've never won a
Correct.
national championship.
Come on.
So, like, yeah, they string together some wins, but they've literally never won
Come on.
anything.
Come
I
on.
mean, you're at least talking about when you go beat Clemson. That's a team that is top 10 in talent rankings. That's a team that never loses at home. And that's also a team that has won 3 national titles
Come on.
in the last 10 years.
Come on.
So then continuing down the line, they beat Mississippi State 5-7, and they fired their coach after the first year.
Thank you.
A&M 7-5. That A&M team lost by 2 touchdowns to Miami, who Florida State beat, fired their coach.
Fired their coach.
Arkansas 4-8, dead last in the West.
Thank
Tennessee 8-4, not a bad win.
Not a bad win.
But they lost to Florida, who
Yep.
Florida State beat in the
Yep.
swamp. So
Correct.
both even there. Now, of course, Florida had a backup there, but so did FSU.
Yep.
And they got blown out by UGA and Mizzou.
Yep.
Again, that is the same Mizzou that beat Middle Tennessee by 4 points.
Yes.
Or beat Memphis by 4 points. So then LSU 9-3, good win. But hey, Florida State beat them by more.
Yep.
And they did it in a neutral site and not at home.
Well, and you also have to qualify that Alabama was losing to LSU when Jaden Daniels got hurt, went out. Alabama came back to win. Let's say Jaden Daniels doesn't get hurt. What does that game look like?
It could be a different game.
Thank you.
And then when you look at the Kentucky, who they played, they're 7-5. And I had this in my notes. I said, okay, well, in fairness, I would call this a decent win. But since everybody says Louisville is trash because they lost to Kentucky by 7, right? Then this is no longer a good win.
Correct.
Or it is, or it's not. I'll let you choose because then Louisville is still a good team.
Thank you.
So there you go. So again, then you get Chattanooga 8-5, but they did lose by 2 touchdowns to the FCS team that Florida State played. Auburn 6-6. They won on a 4th and 31 prayer after they just got beat by New Mexico State 31-10. That's also an Auburn team that hung with Georgia, and also an Auburn team that barely beat Cal, who's 6-6 out of the Pac-12. So which one of these games has sounded really hard so far?
Correct.
Then you get Georgia. That is a huge win, man. Don't get me wrong.
Yep,
Huge
that's
win.
a great win.
But this is also a UGA team that has kind of looked suspect outside of Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Kentucky. They had really 3 good wins. Other than that, they struggled against Auburn. They struggled against South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had said that the one thing I was concerned about with Georgia, and most of you probably have heard me mention that my brother's a Georgia fan. And I told him, I said, the thing that concerns me in that SEC championship game, and I actually predicted the score to be 27-24, but I had Georgia winning, was the fact that Georgia had not played a top 35 defense the entire season.
Yep.
The hardest defense they had played was number 37 Auburn. So I was worried they were going to be able to score in that game. They were thinking they were going to score 30, 40 points, and I didn't think that was the case. Right. So, like, outside of that Georgia win, which was a huge win.
Big win.
What about that schedule that we read sounded hard besides, again, Ole Miss was a good win, but you also got them at home, I believe.
Yep.
You got LSU at home. And then you got, you got most of your hard games at home, which was the same thing with like Texas. Now, we can go through Florida State's schedule. So you had LSU 9-3, blew them out, held them to less
Yep.
points than any SEC team this season. Southern Miss 3-9. Who cares, man? You killed them. They did play one SEC team and they won by 21. That was Mississippi State. Florida State beat them by 53. BC 6-6, ugly win, not a great team. Florida State, of course, we know had the flu. It was a red bandana game, and you went on a 28-0 run in the course of that game.
Thank you. Like, let's not. I hate when people bring this up. Not you, but I hate when everybody brings it up. Oh, he's going. Florida State was going into the fourth quarter up 31-10.
Right, exactly. And then you look at the Clemson game. Yeah, they finished 8-4, but you were the only team to beat Clemson in Death Valley this year. They beat two ranked teams.
Thank you.
And they're literally 64-4 at home since 2013.
Come on now. Come on.
And two of those losses were to Florida State. So, I mean, again, it's different when you talk about where it happened and when. Now, Virginia Tech 6-6, they were not great. They did get better with Kyron Drones at quarterback, but you beat them by 22. You blew them out. So, like, you beat the teams like you were supposed to. Q's 6-6, not a good team. I'm fully aware. I'm fine with admitting that. You beat them 41-3. You beat them like they were a bad team.
Thank you.
So then Duke was 7-5, but they were 5-2 and ranked number 16 when they played Florida State. Leonard got injured, then got re-injured in that game, and they fell off a cliff. Wake Forest, they suck, but hey, they were 1-0 against the SEC, and I mean, you beat the brakes off of them. And they beat Vandy by one less point than UGA did. Pitt 3-9, they're terrible too. You won by 3 touchdowns without your 2 top receivers. Of course, Miami 7-5 rivalry game. They're not great, but they're freaking taking a knee away from being 8-4. You still get the win. UNA, we don't even have to talk about that.
Well, that Miami game. Well, real quick, that Miami game. Think about it. The score probably would have been 27-13, 27-13, if not for one of the most flukiest catches I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Right. And then, that, and then you talk about the UF game. They beat them with a backup. Of course, they had a backup. You also took a knee in field goal range. That could have been 27-15 easily. And then Louisville, you beat them with a third string quarterback, and they were 10-3. So again, man, I just don't see when you read these schedules how it sounds any different. And I won't spend as much time on this one, but even when you look at Texas, they beat Rice. Who cares? They beat Alabama. Great win. That was a different Alabama team. Wyoming 31-10. We already said they were 8-4. Mountain West team, I believe. They beat Baylor 38-6. Baylor, terrible. We just talked about them losing an embarrassing game a second ago. Kansas, they beat 40-14. Kansas should have really probably never been ranked in the first place. They didn't beat anybody leading up to that game. And by the way, they had their backup quarterback. No one's. I've heard nobody mention that Jalen Daniels did not play in that Kansas game.
Correct.
Then you lose to Oklahoma. You beat Houston by 7 points, who was almost, I think, second to last or like one of the last teams in the Big 12. And that's the other thing, man. Keep in mind, too, that I think 4 of the Big 12 teams were G5 teams last year. So it's not even right. So, like, is that even really beating a Power 5 team? You've had 1 year with Power 5 money. So then you beat BYU 35-6. That's a pretty good win, but BYU wasn't any good when they had to play in the Power 5 this year. They beat Kansas State in overtime, which that's not a terrible win. I'll give them that. But that's no better than, to me, you were at home. That's no better than beating Clemson in Death Valley. Then you beat TCU, who was 5-7 by 3 points. And then you beat Iowa State by 10. Iowa State was 7-5, and we just talked about they lost to somebody bad too. You beat the brakes off Texas Tech 57-7. Congratulations. They're not any good either. But in Oklahoma State, man, this is the game that really kills me. This is the one that essentially helped catapult them into the into the playoffs over what Florida State did over Louisville. They beat them 49-21. They were number 18 at the time. Oklahoma State, for the love of goodness, that is the
love of goodness.
That had to be like one of the most overrated teams. I mean,
how are they still ranked?
And again, this is your number 2 team in the friggin' Big Ten. You beat Central Arkansas 27-13. You beat Arizona State 3-9 Pac-12 team 27-15. You got your face kicked in by South Alabama 33-7. Again, you lost to Kansas, or you beat Kansas State by 29-21. You beat Kansas by 7 points. Just go down the line. I mean, they got literally beat by Central Florida, who's 6-6, 45-3. So, like, how were they? First off, how were they ranked as high as they were? And then that's your number 2 team in the Big 12. That is not. I don't think they're better than Louisville.
Correct.
Louisville lost to Pitt. Yeah, that's not a good look. but you also beat Notre Dame.
Yep.
Okay, Oklahoma State beat Oklahoma. Congratulations. But you
Woo.
also got mollywopped by South Alabama. So
Thank you.
yeah, man. I think like as you know, as we step back, and of course you can talk about Michigan. They didn't play anybody the first 9 games of the season,
Yeah.
and they were
Until
cheating the
Penn
whole
State.
time.
Correct.
Right, and then you kind of get a little bit of struggle wins there against Penn State, who again is a good team, but they didn't play anybody this year. The only good teams they played against, they lost. Then you beat Ohio State, who struggled against Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Louisville, they beat them by 13. They beat them by 3 scores
Yeah.
or 2 scores. So I just think like when you take the blinders off of going, this is the ACC, this is the SEC, this is the Big Ten.
Right.
These are not equal conferences. And when you really start to dig into the numbers, you look at how the ACC played the hardest out of conference schedule with the most Power 5 teams, the most ranked teams. And then, you look at the average offenses, defenses that they played. You look at the kind of embarrassing out of conference games and the out of conference records. I think, man, there's so much BS around strength of schedule calculations. I almost thought about creating my own strength of schedule formula for next year because there's just so much subjectivity to it. And the reason we even are doing this episode that I wanted to kind of just attack this as, again, this is not oh, woe is me, Florida State, you should have put me in the playoffs. This is an
Right.
honest conversation about why we're getting things wrong in college football by using assumptions in rankings, assuming that this team is better than this team
Right.
when everybody has warts on their schedule. And I
That's right.
just don't really like it. And again, I don't like the raw combined opponent record argument. We already kind of,
Right.
threw that to the wolves too. So really, man, this was just an open dialogue about why I think strength of schedule is not everything. And I
Right.
think it gets pointed to a lot. It matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter because everybody says, okay, well, what about Liberty? Yeah, but they didn't play a single Power 5 team this year.
Correct.
So I
Correct.
think, yeah, there's a line of delineation between P5 and G5.
Right.
But when you look at all these Power 5 conferences compared to each other, and you kind of like Men in Black flash yourself of what happened the last 10 years with the SEC, and you can't take away the national titles.
No.
You can't take that away from Alabama. They did good. Congratulations to them. And all the other teams that did win one. I just think that in 2023 alone, when you talk about the things that we just mentioned, man, I don't see where the ACC was much weaker than some of these other teams
Correct.
or these other conferences, and I don't see where Florida State's schedule was, say, 55th compared to 5th.
Right.
All because you played Georgia. You played one really good team.
Right.
I just don't see it, man.
No, I really don't either. I don't. Again, the subjectivity of college football is what's destroying college football. Because in any other sport, this doesn't exist. You settle this on the field. You want to know who the best team is? Put them on the field. Let them play. Winner take all. Right. The subjectivity of what we're doing now is just ruining the sport. You're telling these kids who are giving everything they got that, man, I'm so glad you played. I'm so glad you gave all your talent and your skills to this. I'm so glad you bled and hurt and injured yourself and put your body on the line. But in our eyes, you're just not good enough to play for a championship. So, yeah, go to your little meaningless bowl and be happy and whatever. And it's like, no, man, this isn't why the game was created. The game was created to get the best of competitiveness out of us on the field. Let them determine who the best is on the field. That's what every other sport does. And so to look at these schedule and say, well, you played this, and so this means you're harder, you have a harder time. And so if we put FSU in that schedule, if we put Texas in that schedule, then it would have been this and that, and that's how we determine what it is. No, that's all malarkey. Dude, put them on the field, let them play. That's how we determine the best.
Yeah, I agree, man. And it's like when Kirk went on his rage tweet the other yesterday or whatnot. He says it's not bothering him, but that man he is in a cage of emotions right now. Or what was the anchor man? I'm in a glass case of emotions right
That's
now.
right.
Like he's struggling, but again, man, that's just really the thing is there's too much subjectivity. There's too much. This team is better than that team when you don't really. Again, it's based on assumptions, like we said. And when you just look at the data that we've laid out for you, I know this was a really long, stat-heavy kind of episode,
right?
But if you just come into it with an open mind and you just listen to the numbers that we talked about, I think people put too much biases into this thing.
Yep.
And I will say one last point is, the fun thing about the transfer portal is you get a lot of guys that come from other conferences. And,
Yep.
you ask guys like, I think if I recall correctly, they did an interview, and they've done hundreds of these, but one that I remember they did with Keandre Jones, who came from Auburn. And it was
Yeah.
like, is it really that big of a difference playing in the SEC versus playing in the ACC? And they're like, everybody says like, look, man, when you're a Power 5 school with Power 5 athletes, of course you're going to have tougher competition against Alabama than Vanderbilt, the top versus the bottom feeders.
Right.
But across the board, it's relatively even. I mean, you're going to have hard competition everywhere. So
Yep.
that is the one fun thing I think that you see coming out of the portal.
Yeah,
You
you're
get
getting
different perspectives from different conferences.
right. You're getting like in the Power 5, you're getting Power 5 level players at every school. So Alabama with their Power 5 playing let's say a Vanderbilt or a Boston College. They may not be the same level of Power 5 talent, but they're Power 5. Now, what's different about Alabama to Vanderbilt is that Alabama has been stacking the best of Power 5 versus where Vanderbilt is getting probably the lowest tier of Power 5 kids that can play there, right? So yeah, when you have stacks on stacks on stacks of 4 5-star blue chipper Power 5 players, yeah, there's going to be some difference. But people are acting like the SEC up and down the board has stacks on stacks on stacks of blue chipper 4 or 5 stars versus Florida State versus Clemson. No. We've already proven again and again and again that everybody in the Power 5 is getting Power 5 level players. What it comes down to is how many of those top of the top Power 5 players are you getting, and can you stack them up? And that's how and then can you develop them, right? Because you remember Texas A&M literally had the number one ranked recruiting class 2 years ago. And look what happened. 90% of that recruiting class has transferred out of there. They didn't develop them. So again, like to say that one conference is better than the other, your stats, thank you so much for the research, because your stats just proved the point over again that it's subjective, and subjectivity is ruining college football.
Exactly. And even when you look at the 247 team composite talent rankings, Florida State beat number 5 Clemson. They beat number 7 LSU. They beat number 12 Miami. They beat number 15 Florida. And those are all top 15 in most talented teams. And of course, you got some SEC teams up there: Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, LSU, Texas. Well, future SEC. But
Yeah.
I mean, Florida State played as many teams with top 15 talent as pretty much anybody else in the top 4 or 5 teams when you talk about the playoff picture. So, again, man, that's another thing too. So you look at the out of conference stuff, you look at the amount of talent on the rosters that the teams that Florida State played was just as much as anybody else.
Yeah.
Again, like you said, it doesn't matter sometimes it doesn't matter that you have all that talent if you can't do anything with it. In the case of Texas A&M, in the case of Miami, in the case of Florida, these are teams that are uber talented every year, over 50% blue chip ratio, and they don't do anything with it. So that doesn't always mean that you're going to go out there and win just because you have the most talent. And that's just, again, like I said, as we get ready to close this episode out, I just wanted an exercise where we could openly discuss and think about things and realize that maybe the gap between the 55th strength of schedule and the 5th strength of schedule is not as wide as you might think it is. And so hopefully that is at least what I proved to you guys today. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and close this one out. We will be back with you guys for some more episodes coming up. We just dropped one I did with my friend Taylor from Norvell Central on a early signing day preview. You guys know by the time you watch this, we will be less than a week from early signing day. Florida State's got the number 3 class. Maybe can they load some guys up? Can we flip Smith? Can we flip McCray or something like that and end up with the number 1 class? I don't know. Get our thoughts on that in that video as well. Some portal moves. We talked about that too. I'm about to record a video in just a few minutes that's going to drop on this channel about why I think DJ Uyunglele, DJ U.
Ooh, look at you.
Right. I've been practicing, man. I've been trying. Why I think he's going to be the guy that Florida State is going to end up with, and why I think he could be successful in this offense. So be on the lookout for those. Obviously, get in on the conversation on social media. Like and subscribe. if you guys have watched this far. Thank you to our sponsor, Alumni Hall. Sorry, I forget to do your ad read every time, but thank you to our sponsor, Alumni Hall. Guys, Christmas is coming up. Get something for every Seminole on your list at alumnihall.com, 1817 Thomasville Road. Use code SPEAR to get 10% off your order. I'll link it in the description below. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for your support. And as we get out of here, Michael, as always,
As always, go
Go
Noles.
Noles.